I've been doing a series of talks on what's called in Buddhism the three characteristics. And I've given now a talk on the first two, and today I'd like to give a talk on the third one. The three characteristics are the three descriptions, or characteristics, I suppose, of what we experience as reality. And this is a fundamental teachings of Buddhism, but it's not meant to be a teaching like a belief that you're supposed to believe this, or that's supposed to be logical per se. It's supposed to be insights that a person has, that as a person's eyes, the inner eye becomes clearer and clearer, ability to perceive and see what's happening, that this becomes obvious, that our experience of the world is characterized by these three characteristics. The first one is impermanence. That's what we talked about some time ago in the first part of the series. And it's a kind of very radical teaching about how things are always moving and changing in flux, arising, passing away. Things are born, they die. In some sense, there's a very radical pointing to impermanence in Buddhist practice, pointing to how every moment is unique in itself. It arises and passes. And any moment we find ourselves in will never reappear, never be the same again, ever again. There's the preciousness of one moment because it's here just for a very fleeting amount of time. It arises and then it passes. The second characteristic is called Dukkha, and this is usually translated into English as suffering. That somehow our experience is characterized as being suffering. And that doesn't seem like a very nice thing to say about life or experience. Usually, most translators will translate here the word dukkha not as suffering, but rather as being unsatisfactory or unreliable. And that needs a little bit of explanation. And so unreliable in the sense that none of what we normally experience, or nothing that we can experience in this world, can provide lasting reliability. You can't depend on, for your ultimate happiness, your ultimate peace, your ultimate sense of security, on any particular experience or anything you can point to in this world. Partly because it's so fleeting, it's so impermanent. And impermanence can strike at any time. Things that are relatively constant suddenly can change like that, and like the plumbing in this building. You know, we were doing just as fine, and then we were taken by surprise that it didn't work. But there's many things that suddenly will change. The three characteristics, I've not told you the first two what are, but the three characteristics are so intimately part of what they characterize that it's like water is characterized as being wet. And there's, in a sense, you don't push this, there's no wetness apart from water, and no water apart from wetness. So in the same way, there's no things of the world, no reality, experience of reality, apart from impermanence. And there's no impermanence apart from the things of the world. There is no, this unreliability or unsatisfactoriness is a characteristic of things. And there's no unsatisfactoriness that's separate from things. No things are separate from, they're kind of intimately connected like water is wet. The third characteristic, which is that of today, is that of what's called in Pali, the Buddhist language, Anatta. And Anatta is usually translated into modern English, these days into English, as not self. That reality, our experience of reality, is somehow characterized intimately, like wet and water is wet, characterized as being not self. You won't find a self there. Now this kind of points to, this very deep and very important area of human life. Who are you? And some people will spend a lot of time. It's very important for them to discover who they are. And people will base many of their decisions in life very deep decisions in life, important ones, on who they think they are, who they think they want to be, and how, and in the search for themselves, a true self, an authentic self, reliable self, a permanent self, to discover who are we. It's a great quest, right? So this last characteristic is talking about this aspect of self, and what is it all about? What is it? How do we find it? So 3 characteristics that things are. Our experiences of reality is in some fundamental way, it's impermanent, it's unreliable, and it is not self. In modern vernacular, I was going to say Berkeleyese. The person who said that lives in Berkeley. I think it was Wes Nisker who said that those 3 characteristics can be translated into modern English as saying life is hard, it puts you through changes, but there's no need to take it personally. So today we're talking about this not self. Many people are quite perplexed by this. How could the Buddhists talk about not self? Some people call it no self as opposed to not self. It's a very important distinction. But you hear many Buddhists kind of bantering around the concept no self, there is no self. And then you look at yourself and you say, well, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm here. And if I have an itch, I don't scratch my neighbor. What is this no self thing about? The Buddha didn't say no self, he used the word not self. So as we go through this, maybe you understand why that's the case. But as I kind of lay this out to you, I want to do it by telling you a story that comes from the ancient discourses of the Buddha that I find very touching. And you have to use a little bit of your imagination, I think, to kind of get a sense of how this is a kind of touching story. And that how this story lays the context or frame for this issue of self-identity and questioning, looking at it in the way the Buddha is encouraging us to do. The Buddha had a son, one son. When his son was relatively young, he became ordained as first a Buddhist novice. And then at some point when he turned 18 or 19 or something like that, he became a Buddhist monk. And there are a few stories in the canon of the Buddha giving teachings to his son. One of the famous ones, it seems to be when his son, who was probably a young novice, maybe 7, 8, 9 years old, seemingly told a lie. And so here you have his father going to engage his son around his lie. And so there's a nice, very touching, that kind of exchange. The story I'm going to tell you is when the Buddha's son, his name was Rahula, was old enough, when the Buddha decided his son was old enough to hear the deepest teachings he had to offer. So here's a father with a son who wants to really impart something that's, as significant, as profound about life than he can imagine. And he wants to kind of somehow, he feels his son is ripe to be able to hear this. So what he does is he takes his son, and my guess he's probably in his late teens, maybe 19, 20 or something, so he can really maybe old enough, mature enough to hear this. And he takes him deep into the woods. They were kind of living in the woods already, but a little bit on the edge of a town, or close enough to urban life. But they went for a walk deeper into the woods, and it's recorded where he took him. It's called Blind Man's Grove. I don't know why, but that's what, there's no reason to say why, just that's what it was called. And it was a grove that had some very large sala trees, very kind of common tree in northern India that's quite majestic, very large, often kind of praised for its majesty, kind of like the great kind of valley oaks maybe here in California, or these sala trees. And they have, so they're big, the grove with huge, majestic trees. So maybe you can imagine going into a Redwood grove, just you and your parent when you were a kid maybe, or you and your kid. And you go into this, you're only you in this big grove of great, majestic redwood trees. It's very peaceful and still, beautiful, maybe kind of reverent feeling to be there. And these salt trees have these big kind of, I don't know what they're called, but these kind of roots that are above the ground that come down kind of like as these wings, kind of almost, tails or fins. And they sat there on these big roots. And in that context of this peace, of this majesty of being in nature, the Buddha was going to impart his teachings. And impart his teaching of the nature of self, or understanding about the self. And perhaps some of you could imagine here in the modern world that a parent might do the same thing with his or her child. Take the child into the woods or into some place in nature in order to have the right context and right setting to somehow the child's heart, the young person's heart, to be ready to receive something that maybe you can't really hear while the television is on. And I read many years ago an account of a woman who, when she was a child, I don't know how old she was, and I have this idea that story took place in New Mexico, somehow she had a haircut which was a problem, didn't work. Hair was cut short, maybe crooked, I don't know what, somehow it didn't work. And what works and doesn't work for a child is sometimes very different from the parents. But somehow it didn't work. And so she was quite upset. And the father came home to this very upset daughter about her hair. And the father said, "Oh, please, come with me." And they got in the car, and they went to a drive to the edge of some great vista, some place out in nature, maybe on top of the mountain, or they had this tremendous view of the mountains and forests, or I don't know, the mesas of New Mexico or something. And the father said, and he kind of looked at this beautiful place, and he said, nature doesn't care about your hair. And it was the woman who wrote the story, and this was a very important story for her growing up, that his father kind of imparted something to her about self-identity and what's really important. And somehow her hair, what happened to her hair wasn't that fundamentally important, and there was something bigger, more important going on. And so you can maybe imagine in modern world someone taking you, doing something like that with you, or with a child, or a young man, young woman, and they might say things like, as you go about your life, you might find that there are people who are going to try to define you. A lot of people are going to try to define you in some way or other. Some of them are going to be awful, the way they're going to define you. They're very limiting. Don't let other people's definitions of you, who you are, stand in the way of what you do and what you can become. Don't buy into the definitions of our society. So that I can imagine someone saying that. Or I can imagine someone saying, clothes don't make the man. Or, you're something much more profound here than the work you do. Or more profound than, the cars you have or the houses you have. Don't get, as you grow up, don't get confused. And don't confuse your identity, who you really are, with jobs, houses, even relationships, your political party, your ethnicity, perhaps. That all those things are important, but there's maybe something. Don't let that limit you. Don't get stuck in some identity here about who you are. So in that context of being out there in nature in these big majestic trees, that kind of message maybe is heard, because maybe the heart is more at peace or at ease, or the person let go of a lot of the social conventions, ideas that our society has for what it means to be a person in relationship to other people. I can imagine the parent trying to convey to the child or the young person, don't get caught up in comparative thinking, comparing yourself with other people. You can it's a dead end. It's a source of tremendous suffering. And in fact, probably most of the problematic ways in which we hold ourselves, see ourselves, ways that hold ourselves that cause us suffering, have to do with comparing ourselves with others or comparing ourselves with ideals, not living up to it. In the Buddha language, there's a game called selfing. And I can imagine a parent telling the child, there's this game of selfing people do, and you don't have to play that game. In fact, if you play that selfing game, there's no one wins. And so the selfing game is when you try to take yourself as being better than other people, or when you take yourself to be worse than other people, or when you take yourself to be equal to other people. Don't do any of that. Just don't get involved with comparison. There's no need to compare yourself. Live free of that game. When I was 13, my father took me aside. I don't remember where it was. I don't think it was in some great place in nature. But he told me, as you grow up, you're going to have some really weird thoughts. Bizarre. I think he used the word bizarre thoughts. And he said, everyone has them. Don't worry about it. And at some point growing up as a teenager, I realized I had some bizarre thoughts. But I had been warned. And so, I guess everyone has these kinds of things. And so I didn't, it wasn't such a big deal. I didn't identify with them. I didn't take them as myself. I didn't make this whole story of self in relationship to them. Oh, they're just these things passing through. And it's interesting. And I don't know why they're there, but they're coming through. I can imagine a parent telling a young, young adult child, things like around thoughts. You don't have to take your thoughts as being yourself. You have a lot of different thoughts passing through, and every thought you have doesn't have to be believable and doesn't have to be defining who you are. Thoughts are kind of come together for causes and conditions. Some of them you'll never understand. But you don't have to believe them, and you don't have to take them, this really defines who you are. You have a lot of feelings that come through, emotions that come through. You don't have to take those as being what defines you. Emotions come together because of causes and conditions. They pass through, they're impermanent, they rise and pass. And there's no need to latch onto them. This defines who I am. So I don't know if I've kind of played out some imaginary situations well enough, but I encourage all of you to kind of use your own imagination to imagine such a scenario and what profundity around self that you would like to impart to someone, or we wish someone had imparted to you at a crucial point, so you wouldn't have to have learned that wisdom painfully later. So here's the Buddha going to do something similar to his son. He's going to pass on some teachings around what the Buddha sees about the self. But Rahula, the Buddha's son, is already a monk. So he's already someone who is not out there to get, one of these houses on steroids, or cars on steroids, or he's not into, the career path in some way. And it's not all about getting married and having kids, because it's a celibate lifestyle to be a monk. So there's a lot of things that don't apply, or the person's already somehow let go of, or somehow not relating to. So there's a lot of things that maybe people who are staying in a worldly life are still would still be engaged in and need some help with how to engage in it wisely, don't apply, because there's been so much letting go already for Rahula. So what the Buddha says to him is, he actually starts asking him questions, kind of the Socratic method. And the first thing he says, do you have complete control over what your body does? And Rahula says no. You can control your body some, but you can't control old age. You can't control sickness. You can't control, there's a lot of things that happen in your body that, are out of your control. You can do some things, but, to claim you can have complete control over what happens to your body is pretty silly. So the ruler said, no, I cannot have complete control over my body. Then the Buddha says, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. He says, something which you cannot control, would it be appropriate to take that as self? Or the word he uses is atta. Is it appropriate to take it as atta? And now in the modern English, atta is usually translated as self. But I think in the context of in ancient India, the word atta has a very profound meaning that's maybe more profound than the normal, certainly conventional ideas of self in English, or the psychological self. Atta could well be translated as soul. And some translators have translated as soul. And soul is a Western idea. But the Buddhist, so in that sense, is it proper to take what you cannot control as your soul? Because in India in the time of the Buddha, there was this idea that this atta, this kind of little seed or essence or the soul that people kind of believed in, some people believed in, was something that had control, had dominance. So if the body was where the soul is, where you find the soul, then the soul should have body should have some ability to control itself, because that's the soul, right? So when he said no, he was saying no. It's not proper to take the body as the soul or as a self, this enduring self. In Sanskrit, they say Atman instead of Atta. This enduring, permanent, abiding self. Then the Buddha also asked his son, is it appropriate to take that which is the body permanent or impermanent? And his son said, it's impermanent. Then he asked the son, is there lasting and permanent bliss or happiness to be found in the body? And his son said, no, there's no lasting or permanent happiness to be found in the body. There's happiness that can pass through and visit, but there's no guarantee it's going to be there forever. The body's going to be kind of just vibrating full of happiness and delight. So then the Buddha said, now something which you have no control over, which is impermanent, and which is not permanently blissful, is it proper to take that as being the soul? The reason he asked that question that way is that was the definition of the Atman, or the soul in ancient India. Is it had to have sovereignty, power, control. It had to be permanent, forever, and basically, and it had to be blissful. So the Buddha was asking his son, is it proper to take the body, your physical body, as being this atta? And his son said no. Then he did the same thing with the other constituent elements of our psychophysical being, in the way that the ancient Indians or Buddhists organized the self. So it's supposed to be the whole psychophysical being, everything we are, it's supposed to be organized or placed in these 5 categories. So there's the body, then there's our feelings, there's our perceptions, there's the whole inner world of what's called mental formations, our thoughts, our intentions, our motivations, our habit formations, our memories, this whole world, the kind of mental world. And then the 5th kind of element is that of consciousness. And now all aspects of everything we can think of who we are is supposed to somehow fit into these 5 different elements. So the Buddha went through all 5 and did the same analysis or same questions around all of them. And in all of those, Rahula said, no, there's nothing there because it's not permanent, there's no ultimate sovereignty or control over it, and there's no permanent bliss. No place there where I can find a soul, or the atta. It's not appropriate to take that as atta. When the Buddha finished that analysis, then Rahula started an inner process of becoming free. Because when he realized that nothing in a psychophysical being could you find any place or thing that he could hang on to as being the soul, the essential, permanent, abiding self, then he started to give up that search, or that holding on, or that clinging to different parts of our being. Many of us cling to our body. Many of us cling to our feelings. Many of us cling to our thoughts, our perceptions, our consciousness, our volitions. There's a lot of clinging that goes on in relationship to what's happening in the psychophysical being. One of the most tenacious one for someone maybe who's a monastic, maybe for everyone, but what's left for a monastic, is this idea, there is this essential self, this essential soul, and this permanent thing that's a refuge, that's a place where I can kind of permanently kind of abide. And the Buddha was saying, you won't find it anywhere there. If you really look carefully, you won't find in those things a soul or a self. So he has not said there is no self. What he said is, in the empirical experience of yourself, you will find no self. And therefore, the expression not self, the body is not self, feelings are not self, perceptions are not self, mental formations are not self, and consciousness is not self. If you introduce the idea that there is no self, that's a metaphysical statement. To make the statement that you can't find a self in these things is not exactly a metaphysical statement. It means you can't see it. It doesn't make any sense. You see something that's impermanent, you have no control over. You don't see it as being blissful. So something more you see, it's an insight. So then, what happens then to Rahula is he begins to get disenchanted with his body, with the psychophysical being. All the things that he gets attached to as being, this is who I really am. He gets disenchanted with that. He begins letting go, softening, relaxing. The grip, the hold, the drive, the seeking, for that thing. So the expression in Pali is he gets, as nibbida, it's disenchanted. He gets disenchanted. It's a great word because the opposite of disenchanted is to be enchanted. There's a little bit of positive connotations now in the modern West, but enchanted means to be spellbound, be caught in an illusion. So to kind of be disillusioned. Some people think that being disillusioned is a bad thing. It's kind of like depressing, be disillusioned. But disillusion is like the best. I mean, what could be better? If you're living in an illusion, don't you want to wake up and kind of step out of the illusion, be disillusioned from your illusions? I mean, that's what else? What could be better? So he starts this process of being disillusioned, and then as the disenchantment happens, the grip in the mind, clinging, of holding, begins to release. And as that releasing process continues, he's not inclining towards grabbing onto anything, holding onto anything. Then Rahula's mind became free, became enlightened. And the freedom that the Buddha was talking about is one when somehow the mind begins to relax enough, or trust enough, be convinced enough that there's no point to latch onto things, that the mind becomes free. And oddly enough, the mind needs to become free of itself. One of the last little clingings is the mind's clinging to itself. And it's very hard to see that, but then the mind releases itself. In the Zen, sometimes they talk about the bottom dropping out of the bucket, as the mind releases itself. So then some people might say, well, that's all fine. There's no self to be found in the psychophysical being that I usually experience. But there must be a self. There must be a self somewhere. Just a self that I can't see or I can't experience. I read a book and it said there's this, primordial self. And what the Buddha seems to do is he's just not interested in that. If that's the case, it has no importance. If you can't see it or experience it or see how it affects us, then it has no role. Or to say it a little bit differently, if what we're looking for is freedom from the constrictions or the holdings of the heart, the holdings and constrictions of the heart have to do with what we think is really there. And so if we find that that's not really there, then it becomes harder and harder for the mind or the heart to want to cling. So in Rahula's situation, the Buddha just went through this analysis, and Rahula was able to start the process of being disenchanted and becoming free. Perhaps because this atta, or soul, was a much deeper kind of clinging than the conventional psychological self that we often think of when we use the word self. Though sometimes in the modern West, the self, the word self, has attained almost divine status. And when it's done that, I've noticed that at least occasionally, the difference between the divine status of people's self is not very far from its narcissistic status. A certain kind of narcissism, elevating the self to a very high pedestal, and it becomes kind of a self-absorbed kind of approach about myself. It's all about me, what I deserve. It's all about me, right? And there's an expression that you see in advertisements now a lot, isn't it? It's about you. Yeah, it's about me, thank you. When I went, once many years ago, I went to a car dealership, and we were test driving a car around, and he said, of course, you want to get an air conditioner for your car. I said, no. And he said, oh, but you deserve it. I didn't get quite the logic of that, but it's a little bit dangerous once you start telling people they deserve something. You deserve an air conditioner. And so these three characteristics, the first is impermanence. And what is radically impermanent and always changing doesn't qualify as something which can abide, which lasts, right? So if you're looking for a self that lasts, you won't find it in the world that's impermanent and changing. If you think you found it there, holding on to something in the impermanent world as being the permanent self, you're asking for trouble, big trouble. If you start seeing how impermanent are the things that you take as the self, then maybe you can start the process of becoming disenchanted. Does that mean that there is no self? Does that mean that you have to give up all ideas of who you are? No, not at all. In fact, you're supposed to have some sense of who you are. But having some sense of who you are and clinging to ideas of who you are two very different things. And so the movement of insight, the movement of this looking deeply, very deeply into the kind of the structure or the fundamental kind of qualities of this reality we live in, can involve seeing into these three characteristics to help the mind becoming disillusioned from that tendency to take something as being the place for permanent happiness and well-being. Does that mean that we cannot have permanent happiness and well-being? The paradox is, the less that we cling out there in the world of things, including our in here, the psychophysical world that we hold on to, the happier we tend to become. It's not a linear path. Some people, they just stop the process of looking out there or looking for things or holding on to certain things as a self, or what this is going to make the self happy. We'll get depressed. We'll get terrified. We'll feel nauseous. We'll feel all kinds of things, because it's not much different than giving up coffee. And if you have an addiction, there's a withdrawal phase. And so, if we've been addicted to selfing, it's a big change. It's not, we're talking about kind of like the basic psychological structure our life's been built on. And if that structure gets pulled out from underneath us, it can be disorienting for a while. But it turns out that the more you can let go of this clinging to self, holding to self, seeing everything through the filter of self, that a greater sense of well-being and happiness is available. It's counterintuitive to people who think that their happiness is dependent on the things of the world. If I just organize and arrange the world just the right way, if only I get the right spouse. And I got the wrong one. Well, in that case, if only I got the right house, but you got the wrong one. So, in that case, if only I got the right job. Well, I got the wrong one. If only I get the right recreational opportunities then, or hobbies. But I haven't found the right one. It's trying to rearrange the world. Some people spend decades rearranging the world. The Buddhist analysis of how successful rearranging the world is for obtaining a reliable happiness would be that it's like rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. It's going down anyway. It's not going to help. You've got to learn to float. So to begin letting go. And what the Buddhist teaching says, if you can look at the ways in which if we look at the selfing, if we look at how you define yourself and how you're attached to those definitions, what you get attached to as yourself, that's one of the very important keys for learning to become free. It's not always an easy analysis to do. And that's one of the things that mindfulness meditation is meant to help you with. Not so that it's an analytical reflection, you're thinking it out, but as the mindfulness, your ability to see clearly in meditation becomes clearer and clearer, more concentrated. It's kind of like a plow that just kind of plows through the places where the mind is attached and holding. Because, or maybe more like a bow of a boat, because it just moves through the water, because the water that has to part as we stay in the present moment, staying with the moving impermanent flow of the present moment. What has to part away so the boat can go forward is our concepts and attachments of permanence and clinging. So the more and more we stay present, stay in the present moment, all this other stuff has to pass away. It's not necessarily an analytical process then. And then the question is, in the end, how far can you take that process? How far can you take the process of letting go of your self-referencing? What is it like to live a life that is not caught in self-referencing, not attached to self-referencing? What's it like to meet the world without trying to define oneself, or trying to convince other people of who you are, or to protect yourself in your definition? What's it like just to be present? And one of the kind of little clues for what that's like is maybe going into beautiful mountain woods, into the Redwoods or the oak woodlands. Go for a nice hike, feel refreshed, feel inspired by the beauty of it all. Feel the old social conventions of who we are, the city ways, all the preoccupation concerns we have, falling away as we kind of walking up into the woodland hills. And we get to a nice lunch spot, and we take a nice little lunch, we lay down, we have a nice nap, wake up, and we wake up for a little while. There's no concerns. There's no past, no future. There's nothing you have to prove. There's nothing you have to apologize for. There's nothing you have to be. In fact, for a few moments or minutes, there's no self-referencing at all, but rather this tremendous clarity and openness, transparent, translucent awareness that seems to be, maybe hold the whole world that you're seeing. That consciousness awareness is so broad, so peaceful, so transparent, so translucent, so free, that everything seems to happen within it without any idea that it's happening to you. And then the challenge is, that's nice. How does that? What importance does that have when you come down from top? When you come down from the mountain, does it have any? And I would suggest that's very important, because if you have that kind of experience, it becomes a reference for the kind of freedom that it's possible to have in our lives. And then a spiritual practice, is a practice that tries to negotiate or work between that reference of freedom and the lack of freedom we have as we go about our life, caught, preoccupied, afraid, ambitious, angry, attached, and all that. So, the characteristic of not self. It's a very important thing in Buddhism. And so I hope that I was able today to convey some of the meaning of that or the importance of that. And if I didn't, then leave the talk here. Thank you very much.